19. A lot of Black history classes usually open up with slavery ends up with Martin Luther King. What I want to do is go back history before slavery, so to Egyptians. Okay, and so first we're gonna talk about Carter G. Woodson. You want to show the first video? I mean, not the first video, but the first slide. Next slide. Okay, okay. Carter G. Woodson is considered to be the founder of Black history. He was actually from West Virginia. He was born in Virginia, taught at Douglas High School, West, and he's a principal for a while. But he wrote several books, and we started with Black History Week. Okay, now we have Black History Month. Okay, he also graduated from Harvard back in the late or early 1900s, way before DEI, affirmative action. Okay, and so he's very intelligent, and also the whole idea of let's make our history. And I read two of his books. I actually use Miseducation of the Negro in my class almost every quarter. I taught African American psychology, but I also read his first book, The Education of Blacks. Okay, where he goes and looks at the history of the educational system in relation to Black folks. We show the first video.
So let me talk about Carter G. Woodson the way that I think about him. Not as a name, not as a quote we dust off once a year, but as someone who understood what memory means when it's under threat. Woodson was born in 1875 to parents who had been enslaved. That's not background noise, that's the foundation. Slavery wasn't abstract to him, it lived in his house, in his parents' stories, in what they carried and what they were denied. So when people talk about him like he was just an academic, I pause. Because before he ever entered a classroom, he worked. Farms, coal mines, long days. He educated himself at night. And yes, later he does earn a PhD from Harvard. But what changed him wasn't just getting access. It was realizing what was missing once he got inside. Black people weren't absent from history by mistake. We were being removed. And Woodson said if a race has no history, it has no worthwhile tradition. He wasn't being poetic, he was being precise. Because he understood that history isn't just about the past, right? It's about who gets to feel anchored in the present. And he saw something happening in real time. When a people's history isn't taught, protected, and repeated, it doesn't just fade, it fractures. Names disappear, meanings get distorted. Pride turns into confusion. We now have studies that explain how collective memory rarely survives more than a few generations without care. Woodson didn't need data. He was watching it happen to his own people. So he didn't argue, he didn't wait to be included. He built. He founded institutions, he created journals, he trained teachers, because as he warned, when you control a man's thinking, you do not have to worry about his actions. That line still hits. And in 1926, 100 years ago, he created Negro History Week, not as a celebration, but as protection. And even the timing was deliberate. February lined up with dates this country already recognized. Woodson knew that sometimes you have to step into the structure just long enough to carve out room for the truth to breathe. This wasn't selling out. This was strategy. And Woodson was clear about the danger too. He wrote that teaching people away from their own history produces dependency, not confidence, compliance, not clarity. So this was never about trivia. It was never about fun facts. It was about survival. So that's why this month we remember ourselves on purpose. Woodson gave us a reset, a ritual, a way to say we're still here. and we know exactly who we are. Because memory isn't passive, it's inheritance. And Carter G. Woodson understood, long before the language existed, that if we didn't guard this ourselves, then no one else would. Generational wealth isn't just money, it's knowledge. Say his name, Dr. Carter G. Woodson.
That was deep. You want to show that slide? That was really deep. We're talking about in terms of Carter Woodson. Okay, next issue that comes up when you're talking about Black history before 1619, Egypt is the issue. Okay, the thing that really destroyed a lot of our African American scholars, aspiring scholars going to school, was the idea that Egypt was someplace else. Well, Egypt is in Africa. You look at the map today, Egypt is in Africa. It's not created the Middle East to distract it. But also, if you go back and listen to Herodotus or read Herodotus, Aristotle, and those folks, their description of the Egyptians of their time was black skin and woolly hair. And so these next two videos are going to kind of deal with that.
Understand a history that is not a history based in slavery, but a history based in royalty.
Human civilization started in Africa.
Some of the first architectural systems, some of the first engineering systems, some of the first governmental systems.
After visiting Egypt, white scholar Count Constantine Duvalny wrote, "Just think, the race of black men today, our slave and object of our scorn, is the very race to which we owe our arts, sciences, and even the use of speech."
In order to justify the economic drive of the slave trade, there had to be the denigration of black people. And so people began to see these sculptures of people with clear Afroid features. It was just incontrovertible. The facts, the reality that black people had designed this civilization.
Ignore it. Just refuse to publish any facts of African history that don't go along with our racial theories.
When black contribution to civilization is too obvious, let's find a way to attribute it to outside white influence.
Return to Glory, the powerful stirring of the black man. Based upon the book endorsed by such esteemed men like Bill Cosby, Julius Erving, Tony Evans, Tony Campolo, Ben Carson, Ivan Van Sertima, Bishop Eddie Long, and many others, narrated by Adrian Branch.
Everybody always wants to know, what did my ancestors do? What did my ancestors contribute? Because in a way that's saying, I am an important person by heritage. But when that heritage isn't known, then obviously a huge portion of your self-image goes down the drain. And that's why it's so important, I believe, to take that young 6-year-old boy by the hand and walk down the street and give him a black history lesson and point to his shoes and say it was Jan Madsliger, a black man who invented the automatic shoe lasting machine. And he steps on that clean street and you tell him it was Charles Brooks, a black man who invented the street sweeper, those machines with the big brushes. And down that street comes one of those big refrigerated tractor trailer trucks and you tell him it was Frederick Jones, a black man who invented the refrigeration system for trucks later adopted for airplanes, boats, and trains. And it comes to a stop at the red light and you tell him it was Garrett Morgan, a black man who invented the traffic signal. And you can tell how he also invented the gas mask that saved lots of lives during the war. And while you're talking about the war, Henrietta Bradbury, a black woman who invented the underwater cannon, made it possible to launch torpedoes from submarines. And while you're talking about black women, you can talk about Madam C.J. Walker, a black woman who invented cosmetic products for women of dark complexion, was the first woman of any nationality in the United States to become a millionairist on her own efforts. And you'll walk past the hospital and you can talk about Charles Drew and his contributions to blood banking, the understanding of blood plasma. Daniel Hale Williams, the first successful open heart surgery in the world, at an operative mortality rate of only 1.5%. You can talk about Lewis Latimer, who was the right-hand man of Thomas Edison, a black man, who came up with the filament that made the light bulb work for more than 2 or 3 days, who invented the electric lamp, who did pioneering work in incandescent and fluorescent lighting, who diagrammed the telephone for Alexander Graham Bell. Tremendous inventor in his own right. Almost no one knows of him.
The Europeans began to manipulate history when they rose and began to expand into the broader world in the 15th and the 16th century because they had to justify the slave trade and they had to justify the colonial system that followed. And modern racism has its incubation in that period. You cannot enslave a man and say he's a human being, that he has humanity, and that he was one of the forerunners of the world's religion. You cannot enslave an African and say this about him. Because if you say he's a human being, then you're saying he's an extension of you. Then you cannot sell an African Christianity and call him a heathen and acknowledge the African contribution toward the creation of Christianity. So it's a contradiction. The European had to literally strip history of the contributions of non-European people.
All right, so I think picture Diop on there. Van Sertima, keep him there. I'm talking about Van Sertima. Ivan Van Sertima. He's written several books. I actually got a chance to meet him, and he spoke when he spoke to Seattle Central. And he's famous for the book They Came Before Columbus, okay, where he cited evidence that Africans from West Africa had been to the what we call the Caribbean and parts of the Americas, 1200, around 1200s. In other words, almost over 100 years before Columbus. You want to the next slide. And then John Henry Clark, that was the last speaker that was on there. He was a historian who talked about it. You kind of see where he was talking about. He was really big during the 1970s, 1980s. You want the next slide. Okay. W.B. Du Bois. W. Du Bois, one of the greatest scholars America ever produced. He got his PhD from Harvard in late 1800s. Okay, so let's say way before DEI or any type of affirmative action. Okay, he taught at Fisk University, and he wrote several books. And what amazes me is that a person this guy got his bachelor's degree at Fisk. Then he went to Harvard and got a second bachelor's degree, and then he got his PhD in sociology. Okay, PhD in sociology. In other words, he graduated top of his class at Harvard University. Okay, back in the late 1800s. You want to show next one? Next. And then this is a right out of Ivan Van Sertima's one of his books that he wrote. In other words, when Napoleon's army marched into Egypt and saw that nose and the African features, he turned his cannon and shot the nose of the Sphinx off. Okay, now you want to show the next two videos?
He proved that the ancient Egyptians were black. This is the story of Cheikh Anta Diop. Born in 1923 in Senegal, he studied at the Sorbonne, where he challenged Eurocentric narratives about Egypt. When his thesis was rejected in 1954, he published it as Negro Nations and Culture, drawing on ancient testimonies like Herodotus's description of Egyptians as black-skinned with woolly hair, and using linguistic evidence. He revealed deep connections between ancient Egypt and black African cultures. Cheikh Anta Diop's legacy is a symbol of courage and the decolonization of history.
Black people have lost their identity, but our oppressors have not lost our identity. That's just why they chopped those noses off of the Pharaoh and the Sphinx in Egypt in the first place, is because without this nose, we can tell you this is whoever it is. But with that in the nose, it can only, why would somebody vandalize a whole face and only vandalize one part? Nobody wanted to knock an eye off or take an ear off, or no chins missing. No, just the nose.
Think about that. The British Egyptologists came in and knocked all the noses off of a lot of those figures, and now they make excuses. Well, it's because of the spirit. No, that was done by the British and French archaeologists / Egyptologists. Okay, and then Ivan Van Sertima's video. You'll throw that in the next video.
Today, we're diving into the powerful legacy of Ivan Van Sertima, a historian, linguist, and scholar who reshaped our understanding of African history. From his groundbreaking book, They Came Before Columbus, to his testimony before the U.S. Congress. Van Sertima dedicated his life to uncovering the true impact of African civilizations on the world. Stay tuned as we explore 5 fascinating facts about this revolutionary thinker. Fact 1. Ivan van Sertima, a Guyanese-born historian and anthropologist, is best known for his book They Came Before Columbus, 1976, in which he argued that Africans had contact with the Americas long before Christopher Columbus. He presented evidence such as linguistic similarities, African-style art in pre-Columbian cultures, and the presence of African genetic traits in some indigenous American populations. Fact 2. Van Sertima was not just a historian, he was also a linguist who studied the connections between African and indigenous American languages. His research explored how African civilizations influenced cultures worldwide, challenging Eurocentric historical narratives. Fact 3. In 1987, Van Sertima was invited to testify before the U.S. Congress during hearings on the contributions of Africans to world history. He used this platform to emphasize Africa's role in early civilizations, particularly its influence on science, engineering, and navigation. Fact 4. Van Sertima was a professor of African studies at Rutgers University for over 3 decades. His lectures and writings inspired countless students and scholars to re-examine African history from a more Afrocentric perspective. Fact 5. To further his mission of highlighting African achievements, Van Sertima founded the Journal of African Civilizations, which published scholarly research on the contributions of African cultures in fields such as astronomy, mathematics, and engineering. His work continues to challenge mainstream historical narratives and inspire new generations of researchers.
Yeah, Van Sertima and Diop were friends. Okay, and they used to, travel together and hang out together and those type of issues right there. So it's really interesting. The one time I did get a chance to meet Van Sertima, he got to talk about his experiences with Diop. I want to skip the 7th one and go right to the 8th one. But we're talking about the Moors. The Moors. Okay, and this video is going to kind of touch on that.
The failure of many historians to really address, as I've coined some years ago, the Moorish legacy, to bring out the truth about the Moorish legacy, is what has led to the level of ignorance that still exists today. Folks didn't know that they were, Moors, who were the Moors? They just knew they were Negroes or black, right, or colored folks. So from 7/11 begins this increased connection to other parts of the Islamic world. The largest empire, larger than the Roman Empire, larger than the Greek Empire. And it results in bringing knowledge in different areas of metallurgy. You have people having access to ancient knowledge. And one of the most dominant and noteworthy aspects of this, of course, is then the advances in the sciences. That's what's so disturbing, is that the hiding of that great legacy that had tremendous impact. (710) or 711 of the Common Era, or AD, Anno Domini, basically is when the Moors, or when the African Islamic armies and Asiatic Islamic armies invade the Iberian Peninsula. Most of them are coming from North and Northwest Africa, and most of them, in terms of the troops, are Amazigh, or so-called Berber. But the leadership is coming from Damascus. They're Syrian, and part of what's known as the Umayyad dynasty. So they invade the land. But what's interesting about what's going on is, well, there are two things. One, there'd always been Africans and people from the Near East, Asian peoples, going into the Iberian Peninsula, what we know today is Spain and Portugal. So that was not unusual. There was always exchange back and forth across the Straits of Gibraltar, which used to be called the Pillars of Hercules, in reference to when the Greeks had influence. But with this invasion, which is largely the result, I would say, of 2 or 3 things that are going on. One is that the religion of Islam is indeed spreading. So you have larger numbers of people in Africa and other parts of Asia, and in some parts of Southern Europe, but primarily not so much, because it starts, of course, in the Arabian Peninsula, who are either converting to Islam on their own or being encouraged to convert, usually for purposes of trade, for example, and fitting in. But the other thing that's happening is that the Christian population in the Iberian Peninsula, led by people like King Roderick, are not really treating their own population very well.
That one A on other Timbuktu, the if time. You don't have that one? No. Okay, don't worry. Okay, and so think about what we just covered. Okay, look back at Egypt. Okay, talking about how Egypt was taken out of Africa, and if you go back and look a little deeper, and how the ancient Greeks saw the Egyptians, and then Moors. You hear the term Moor if you read any Shakespeare's literature or any during that time period. You hear them refer to Moors consistently. Now, when you think about Moors, they're usually referring to Black people or people who are dark complected. Okay, and so announcement. The Call for Conscious Museum opens this weekend, Valentine's Day, and it'll be open Thursday and Friday from 3 to 7 p.m. and on Saturday and Sunday from 11 a.m. to 5 p.m. And tickets are Call to Conscious. You can go online and get those, right? Okay, and then you have also special Black History Month events this week with tribute to Dr. Quintard Taylor. I had several students who took Dr. Quintard Taylor's classes, and all of them were impressed by the amount of knowledge that this individual had. So in other words, it's been 5:30 p.m. and then Thursday, original play songs of the forgotten. Anyway, I can't see around it. But anyway, that's on Thursday. I forgot. Okay, play songs of forgotten at 7 p.m. on Thursday. Okay, so there's a lot of stuff going on this time around the issue. Could you go back on some of the slide? The slide will be up on it. Oh, you can leave it there. Yeah, that's Hannibal. Hannibal is a coin. Hannibal was an individual who was a general and actually almost defeated the Romans. I mean, he had went over the Alps, and he was elephants. He's known for his elephants. Okay, that was going on at that time. We're talking about Carthage. Okay, he was a general for Carthage, Hannibal Barcus. What's really interesting is another video of Denzel on it. Netflix is actually putting out a movie. Okay, Netflix putting out a movie about Hannibal. I'm looking forward to when it comes out, where Denzel Washington is playing Hannibal, and so I'm looking forward to when it comes out. I've been reading about it for over a year now, but I'm not really sure when it's going to come out. One issue is that the people in Tunisia were offended that Denzel would play the role of Hannibal. And I'm saying now, is that because he was a Black guy, or is that just because he was whatever? But either way, it's really interesting the way they handled it. I remember in elementary school when they talked about Hannibal, they showed a picture of a white guy riding an elephant. Okay, so it's just totally bogus. You stop and think about it. Where will we get the elephant? But also the thing about Hannibal and Carthage is that they had all kinds of people allies, because Carthage was just a city, and most of their soldiers were mercenaries from other places. They had Namibians on horses, they had the elephants, they had special archers, they had all kinds of individuals. And the only thing is that if they had support from their home team, at least the people they possibly could have or had the food and stuff or resources, they could have even defeated Rome, which is really interesting. And then there's Timbuktu. I didn't have a chance to cover Timbuktu. Timbuktu was I guess, was second library. If you count Alexandria as being the first library, we're talking about the Empire of Mali now. The Empire of Mali, we're talking about 1200 BC. 1200 AD. 1200 AD. And so this is once again before Christopher Columbus, and there's research showing that they were even doing cataract surgeries during that time period in Mali. And so a lot of different things going on before was 16 before slavery. And like I mentioned before, is a lot of your history classes start with slavery, Martin Luther King. But now with this information, to do some further research. I highly encourage you to read some of these individuals: Ivan Van Sertima, Chiantha Diop, John Henry Clark, Carter G. Woodson, Hakeem Metabuti, Jawanza Kunjufu, and all these other individuals who are Runoko Rashidi, various other individuals out there who provide evidence, for all this. Because like I said before in all my previous things, the opposite of woke is sleep. And they're trying to erase people's history. And if you erase the history, they don't know who they are. And if they don't know who they are, they'll buy into whatever people tell them. And back to Carter Woodson, in terms of education is kind of a double-edged sword. On one level, you need the education to get out there and be competitive in the job market. But at the same time, the social studies classes oftentimes teach self-hatred, for not only African Americans, but students of color in general. And so that's the key to being the importance of educating and read as much as you can. But also, when you talk about teaching children how to read, children read and learn faster when the characters in the book look like them. I'll repeat that. Children are more likely to read, enjoy reading more if the characters look like them. And so thank you for your time. And it's been a lot of fun. And I'll see you on March 10th.